very delighted to be hosting this webinar on new Title IV tools for tribes to take advantage of opportunities under Fostering Connections. We're very pleased to welcome as our presenters today Terry Cross and David Simmons. Terry Cross is the Executive Director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, and David Simmons is the Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy.
Hello, everybody. Hi.
So in this webinar, we will be briefly reviewing the webinar features and the question and answer tools to enable you to participate in this webinar by sending questions to us as David and as Terry present. There'll be a brief overview of the Fostering Connections Resource Center, a review of the Fostering Connections Law and the tribal provisions of the Act, and most importantly, the heart of this webinar will be new Title IV tools that tribes can use. We'll conclude the webinar with a wrap-up. I realize that I did not introduce myself as I began talking. My name is Madeline Freundlich, and I work as a network manager for the Fostering Connections Resource Center, and am very, very honored to be the network manager for tribal issues and to be able to work very, very closely with Terry and David on the work of the Resource Center on the tribal issues as they relate to fostering connections. With respect to webinar logistics and questions and answers, we want you to know that the slides that David and Terry will be sharing with you this afternoon will be available on the Fostering Connections website after this webinar concludes. So we know that often participants in the webinars are very eager to have copies of the slides, so we want to assure you that they will indeed be available. You merely need to log on to the Fostering Connections website, and we have it here, the URL for you on this slide, in order to get copies of their wonderful presentation. If you will notice on your screen, there is a control panel feature. There is a double arrow on the side, and here you see on this slide a red arrow pointing to it. You can minimize that panel by clicking on it, and then if you want to reopen it by clicking on those arrows again. Importantly, there are opportunities to ask questions during the webinar. You will be on mute. You're automatically muted throughout the session, but we're happy to take your questions in writing. As you can see on this slide, you will go to the questions log and type in a question for the presenters in the text box at the bottom of this question pane. Then hit send, and it will arrive. We will try to respond to as many questions as possible during the webinar, but if we're unable to respond to your question, we will definitely follow up with you after the presentation. The Fostering Connections Resource Center is committed to responding to all questions, and we promise you that we will do that in large part by consulting with the National Indian Child Welfare Association. Just a little bit about the Fostering Connections Resource Center. Many of you may already be familiar with it. For those who may be new to the Resource Center, it is dedicated to providing timely and reliable tools and information on all aspects of the Fostering Connections Act. The goal is to provide key decision makers, whether at the state, tribal, or local level, with information that is important for them to have about the law and to give them the maximum possible support as they plan to implement the law and actually carry out its implementation. The Resource Center is very grateful to the foundations that have generously supported it. As you see, we have received funding, we've received the support from the Annie Casey Foundation, Casey Family Programs, the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption, the Duke Endowment, Eckerd Family Foundation, the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, Sierra Health Foundation, Stewart Foundation, and the Walter S. Johnson Foundation. It is quite wonderful to have such a group of illustrious foundations committed to child welfare supporting the Resource Center. So what does the Resource Center provide? First, and very importantly, nonpartisan data and resources on each section of the Fostering Connections Act. The website is designed to make it very easy to access a range of information on the Act itself and implementation. You can also find an up-to-date list of all the federal guidances that have been issued with respect to fostering connection, as well as research briefs, examples of best practices, examples of state legislation that has been enacted in order to implement the Act. Individualized technical assistance is available as the Resource Center, working very closely with our network partners such as NCWA, field questions from state and tribal leaders, and connect decision makers with key experts that can help them in implementing fostering connections. The Resource Center also monitors implementation activities and allows users to stay up to date on what is happening at the federal regulatory level, other events that are happening in the field, any congressional hearings on fostering connections, and general developments on best practices and approaches to implementation, whether that be on the part of states or by tribes. And finally, there are opportunities to communicate with experts and peers. We encourage you to visit the website, subscribe to mailing lists, continue to join webinars as you are today, and participate in online discussion forums that are hosted by the Resource Center, and which allows also for connections to our many collaborating organizations. Partners play a central role in the efforts of the Resource Center. As we see today, our partner, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, is playing a critical role in this webinar. The networks are managed by issue experts who work with each leading partner organization. And as you see on the slide, the 6 areas on which network partners work and the national partners that work with us. We're very pleased that on tribal issues, the National Indian Child Welfare Association is our network partner, and I'm very pleased to be the network manager for the work that we do together. More than 25 national organizations serve as collaborating partners, and we welcome the opportunity to feature additional research and resources. So if you, as a state or tribal organization, have resources or information, please contact us about featuring your organization's information on the website. So we're beginning today with this webinar, recognizing the vital importance of the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act that was signed into law on October 7, 2008, and is incredibly significant in strengthening the ability to provide services for children and their families who come into contact with child welfare systems, and today to specifically focus on the tribe's role in providing services to children and families. So with that, I am going to, let me just give a little bit more background on the Fostering Connections Act. It does amend Title 4E, provides tribes with the new opportunities to apply for and administer for foster care, adoption assistance, relative guardianship assistance programs, and independent living services. And that is precisely what we're going to be hearing about on our webinar today. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn the webinar over to our experts, Mr. Terry Cross and Mr. David Simmons.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about the feasibility of tribes financially applying for this to run their own 4E programs, and David will be talking about some specific provisions of the law. David, do you want to say anything before I begin the calculator?
I think actually I'm going to go first.
Okay.
I think we just made a change there.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure I have the controls for the slide.
Yep, I just gave you the mouse, David.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, well, it's not working. For some reason, it's not working, but I'll tell you what. Carrie, why don't I just tell you when to flip the slide, and that'll work.
Sure, that's fine.
So go ahead and go to slide 9. Next slide. So for all of you on the call, I'm sure some of you have experience with Title IV-E, whether you're a tribe who's been doing it through an agreement with the state, maybe you're preparing to make a direct application, or you're a federal official who's been working with it for many years, or a state official. But we just wanted to start by giving a little bit of background because it is a new program in many respects for many tribes. It is the largest source of federal child welfare funding out there. It's part of the Social Security Act. It's different in that it's not a grant program like other programs might. It's not a block grant. It's a reimbursement program, and it has both mandatory and optional program components. The foster care and adoption assistance are mandatory. The independent living and also the relative guardianship are optional programs. So you don't have to operate those if you don't want to. And so how does an entitlement program? Well, it continues to fund the services, or reimburse, in this case, reimburse for services that have already been provided, as long as the child continues to have need and it meets the eligibility requirements. So for tribes that would be applying for this program, it would operate different than the Bureau of Indian Affairs program, for instance. And so as long as there were children in care who were meeting these eligibility requirements, the money would continue to flow. It also, but because it's an open-ended entitlement, it has some pretty extensive requirements. And to be able to do it successfully, you have to have tight administrative controls and management. You have to have good collaborations among the different service providers and collaborating partners that you'll be working with, like the courts, administrative staff, fiscal people, and such. And you have to be able to have sort of an ongoing kind of commitment to being able to manage the program and be able to look at how you can make this program fit with your other programs. So sometimes we talk about a continuum of services. This is just one piece of that service. Primarily, it helps support children who have been removed from their homes and are placed in out-of-home care. But there are other services that children need that also have to be provided for, and you'll have to look at sort of how you do that with other funds. Go ahead and go to slide 10, please. So how did we come to the decision to develop the decision-making matrix and also the fiscal calculator? Well, we were, as we were involved, NICWA was involved early on, many, many years ago, in trying to advocate for tribes to get access to all of the funds, essentially, that states had access to be able to provide child welfare services. And as this long-term work came to fruition in 2008, we knew that there was going to be, it's going to have to be a very concerted effort to try and help tribes be able to gain the kinds of information they need, not just sort of the technical aspects of what is 4E, what are the requirements, but also the integration of how this might work in a tribal setting and within a tribal context. So we were fortunate to have the support of Casey Family Programs in helping us develop these two tools. They've been very gracious in giving us help with that. And we designed them to be primarily for tribes that are interested in direct funding. That's applying straight to the federal government to operate the Title IV-E program. But it could also help tribes who are interested in other kinds of avenues, such as developing an agreement with your state. You have both of those options under Fostering Connections. And but the tools here are really meant to help somebody in either case who's sort of at that initial stage and is thinking about how are we going to make an informed decision, how are we going to measure our readiness to be able to commit to this program. And so it isn't going to have, the information here is not going to address all 4E requirements. It's going to address the majority of them, but we went through and we kind of tried to identify those that we thought were most critical to tribes understanding in order for them to say in that first step of the process, is this a good fit for our community? And so in doing that, we've got information on all of the different key issues that we identified and some of the related program infrastructure and requirements. Okay, go ahead to slide 11. So in developing this, a 4E program, and now we have 7 tribes who are Title 4E development grantees, and what that means is that they've got a grant which also was authorized through the Fostering Connections Act to help them develop over 2 years the infrastructure and the readiness to be able to submit an application to ACF. So in doing that, most of those tribes have teams, and we think that's a great idea too. So we wanted to give you a little bit of information about what you might want to consider in terms of that process. This isn't meant that this is the only way you could do this, but this is just some ideas, because there are certainly it's a very intensive program. So developing a steady team, that's your first step probably. Thinking about the leadership that you have from tribal leadership, what kind of support do you have there? The child welfare program, the court, fiscal management, fiscal staff, out-of-home licensing, recruitment, retention, and other key service providers or community members. And in some cases, you'll need to reach out to probably people who are working in education, because you need to maintain records that have educational elements in them too. So and health providers as well, because there are some requirements around what kind of data you collect and what kind of case records you keep. So, and then we also would suggest that you use, to begin with, sort of the decision-making matrix and the fiscal calculator to help you begin sort of your process. But there are certainly other TA resources you could use to learn about the program. Your regional ACF office staff have some good resources. They also have a T&TA network. And there are other Indian organizations, too, that have resources. The Association on American Indian Affairs, National Congress of American Indians, the National and the Fostering Connections Resource Center, which we're a part of. So there are a variety of resources, and we hope that you become familiar with those as you kind of move through your process. And then you probably need to kind of do sort of an assessment and develop a TA plan to kind of figure out where are the areas that you already have. You already have the infrastructure. You're already doing some of the work that 4E requires. And where are some areas where you need some to maybe fill in some gaps, maybe need to get some more assistance. And what kind of assistance are you needing, and who might be able to fulfill that? And in order to be able to kind of operationalize that, you'll need to become familiar with the network of TA providers and consultants and people that are out there. One of the things that we did when we developed these tools, specifically the decision-making tool, is that we saw that there were some good resources out there that described what Title 4E was, what its technical requirements were, and even raising some questions. And we used a lot of those tools. Many of them came from the Children's Bureau in developing our matrix. But what we didn't see was tools that added a third component, which was to sort of help people think about how do you integrate those kinds of things, those requirements that work into your tribal setting, into your tribal practices. And that's really how the decision-making matrix is different than some of the other resources out there. Okay, next slide, please. So how did we organize this? Well, we organized it by domain areas. First of all, I want to tell you that the document itself is about 50 pages long. It's a little over 50 pages, and so it's very extensive. We didn't have time in this workshop, in this webinar, to be able to go over the whole document. And both of the fiscal calculator and the matrix are currently being piloted through a process with Casey Family Programs and some of the tribes who are doing the work to get ready for 4E. We expect to have the pilot done here before the end of the year and sometime in the fall, hopefully. And then we'll be able to get the tools completed, finalized, and then maybe out for broader dissemination. So what you're going to see today and what I'll be describing it's just the slides. We can't disseminate the tools yet until we have all of the information and kind of have finished our pilot. But I'll give you a good idea about how it works. So there's 10 domain areas, and what we did is we tried to divide up the requirements in 4E, and there are many, many of them, into areas that sort of made sense, whether it was program infrastructure or framework, whether it had to do with eligibility or it had to do with independent living. We tried to divide them up, and you'll see what those are in a minute. And then we talked about what were the opportunities for implementation. In some cases, in many cases, 4E requirements, there's only one way you can meet that requirement, and that's what you need to do. In other places, there's some discretion, both for states and tribes. And so we tried to identify those areas where there was discretion. And then the third component, which I sort of talked about a little bit earlier, is where we actually tried to say, okay, now that we know about how this requirement works and maybe what any kind of opportunities or discretion are out there, what do we know about some of the tribal service experiences out there in child welfare and how tribes have dealt with some of these kinds of issues before, and how does this integrate into the tribal service delivery systems, funding schemes from other programs like Bureau of Indian Affairs programs, tribal law, and things like that. And so we tried to have a discussion within each of these requirements about what are some ways to think about this, maybe even some strategy or approaches. And where we found resources, we tried to also indicate what those were. And a lot of those happen to be technical bulletins or federal guidance from the Children's Bureau or ACF. In other cases, it might be a paper or some kind of research that had come out that was relevant to the topic or requirement. So then our disclaimer which is that the decision-making matrix is not an exhaustive list of all federal program requirements. It's only, again, really intended for people to kind of get a sense of, is this a program that we think we could do? Is this something that we would want to do? And then be able to help them to move into a more, probably an approach or a phase of study and implementation where it's much more looking at all of the structure and being able to try and pull it together for an application. Next slide, please. So the first domain area is program framework, and underneath here you can see that we have 7 key federal program areas and by the bullets. Some of these may not make much sense. FMAP, it stands for Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, and that helps either a state or a tribe, once you've developed an FMAP, decide or figure out what your both federal and non-federal match rates are going to be. But you can see there's a lot of different areas, and then under some of the areas there'll actually be more than one requirement, but these are the way we kind of broke them out. And I'll give you an example. The FMAP is something that states and tribes and states who have been in agreements together, the tribe would be using the state's FMAP, which is typically lower than what a tribal established FMAP would be, basically because the FMAP looks at income levels within a certain service area. And so under the Fostering Connections Act, tribes can develop their own FMAPs, which has, in their service area, which has some implications both fiscally, but it also has some programmatic implications from it too. And so we discussed a few of those. And it's the same with service population. A tribe under Fostering Connections can establish their own service population, service area, and that could be on the reservation. It could even potentially be off the reservation, depending on what the tribe sees as a viable and a desirable area to set. So we talked a little bit about what a tribe might want to consider in developing their service population as well. So those are some of the things under the program framework that we tried to pull out and help people with. Next slide, please. Domain area 2 has to do with individual child eligibility, both 4E and Medicaid. How many people on the call, well, I guess I can't answer 75 on the call, but I didn't know how many of you know, but that if you're eligible for Title 4E, a child is eligible, then they're also eligible for Medicaid as well. So there's a connection between Title 4E and Medicaid that helps children who are in foster care access health services if they need that kind of access. Well, this is another area where we talked about, as you can see, AFDC eligibility. And what does that stand for? Aid to Families of Dependent Children. That's a program that no longer exists. TANF replaced that program back in 1996. But Title 4E in determining the individual child eligibility still uses some of the AFDC criteria that were in place as of, I think it's June 16th of 1996. So if you're a tribal child and you're trying to determine eligibility for that child, then you'd be looking back to the state and their AFDC criteria on that date that was established in 1996. There's also extensions, optional extensions, not mandatory, for 4E benefits for services to youth who are age 19, 20, or 21. We discussed what does that mean? What does that look like if you're trying to expand eligibility for foster care and relative guardianship as examples, and how that would play out, and what are some of the things you'd want to consider, because there are, again, programmatic and fiscal impacts to doing that. And then I guess I mentioned the categorical eligibility for Medicaid that also exists. And we know that in many cases for on-reservation youth, the Indian Health Services already has an MOU with Medicaid. And there, in that case, many children who go to Indian Health Services for health services are already accessing, and elderly may not know that, accessing Medicaid funds. There are some other things to consider, too, in thinking about Medicaid. And there are some tribes in the country that have established agreements with their state to, as an example, to get targeted case management funding for children who are in foster care to help with some of the case management around health needs. So there were some things that we also mentioned in our matrix about that. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. There we go. So domain area 3 is foster care, adoption assistance, and relative guardian assistance. Relative guardianship assistance is the newest of the services that are fundable under 4E. It is part of Fostering Connections, and it provides a real nice opportunity for another permanency option, a supported option, subsidized option for tribes that would choose this. So there are some things to think about as well. It's versus relative guardianship as an optional versus mandatory, which are foster care and adoption assistance. You can see that we have some of the domain areas contain a number of different requirements here. Some of them are court-related. Some of them are case plan-related. Some of them, like the bottom one, due diligence to identify and provide notice of placement to all relatives. That's a new Fostering Connections requirement as well. Next slide, please. And here's some more, and we have reasonable efforts. The second one down, the termination of parental rights, and some of you may be using customary adoption or be considering developing a customary adoption process for your kids for permanent placement. Customary adoption, for those of you that don't know, is a permanent placement that relies on sort of the traditions, the customs, and also some of the beliefs of tribes and their practices, their traditional practices. At NICWEL, we've helped tribes support them in reviving some of those traditions. Many of them have not used sort of the traditional termination of parental rights to be able to take a child and place them in that permanent home, and instead trying to keep intact those relationships that the child has with their birth family. Under Title 4E, you can use customary adoption, and you can use it and also receive the funds to support those kinds of placements. So we have some discussion about, well, how does that look and what would that require for a tribe? How might they integrate the thinking about termination of parental rights and customary adoption? So there's some information there. And there's also some information about adoption assistance as well, and the subsidies, and thinking about what size of subsidy would you set, and how would that be in relation to other subsidies within the out-of-home placement kind of options that you have. Next slide, please. Domain area 4 is independent living. This is a new program for tribes as well. Under the Chafee Foster Care and Independence Program, there had previously been some assurances that states had to give the federal government that they were providing those independent living services on the same basis to Indian children as they were to other children within the state, and also to consult with tribes on the development of their services. Now, with Fostering Connections, tribes can actually not only develop agreements with states as they could before, but they can also apply directly to the federal government to operate the Chafee Independent Living Program. And in order to do that, of course, the tribe has to be operating the 4E program too, but that's a new option, and it's something that when we look at some of the data out there, we realize that tribal youth are underserved as opposed to overserved in the foster care population. They're underserved in the independent living service area. And so this is another option, a new area with some exciting opportunities for tribes. And as you can kind of see here, we gave you an example. This is very abbreviated, but it's how we would, in the document, sort of lay this out. We would tell you, here's the requirement. We would state the requirement, and then when the tribal opportunities. And here we've mentioned that the tribe has the option to extend the benefits for youth up to age 23. So there is some opportunities there, some decisions to be made. And then some of the discussion points, we talked about the benefits of operating the program directly or by agreement. And how does that play with the eligibility of tribal youth to receive state services? One of the issues that we found that we included in our discussion is that not long after Chafee Independence, the Chafee program was authorized, there was a question about those tribal youth or those youth who were under tribal jurisdiction, were they eligible to receive state services? And then the answer to that was yes, they are. So there's a couple of ways to think about how you might configure your program and maximize the opportunity to get the resources you need to serve these youth. And that's some of the things that we try to bring out in this document. Next slide, please. Domain Area 5, this is licensing, background checks, home studies, interstate placement. There's a lot of, NCWA has some sort of model, we'll call them model national standards for licensing of tribal homes. A number of tribes have used them and kind of adapted them to be able to develop their own licensing standards. But we also know that there are other issues out there, and some of those relate to other federal laws, like the Adam Walsh Act, that impact criminal background checks. And in many cases, one of the things that happens when we get new law like Fostering Connections is that it's hard to anticipate or basically cover all of the issues that are going to come up for any given population. And for tribal children, that's no different. And so there are some sort of sometimes seemingly confusing pieces of information and requirements out there about how tribal children might be impacted or tribal programs might implement things like background checks, home studies, and things like that. And sometimes it just happens that there isn't sufficient law or guidance to cover these things. Now, we can't answer all those questions, of course, but what we can do is point out where some of those gaps are, because sometimes it might be law that's under the purview and the oversight of the Children's Bureau or Administration for Children and Families. In other cases, it may be law that's under the Department of Justice or may be under the Department of Interior, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs resides. So we tried to make sure that all of those pieces are there, including some information about interstate placement, the interstate compact, too. Now, tribes aren't specifically part of the interstate compact at this point, but the Indian children do have the interstate compact come into play with the interstate compact sometimes on those interstate placements. And so there are some things for tribes to know about how does that affect their ability to place kids maybe from one tribe to another, across state lines, maybe with a relative in another state. So again, we tried to cover some of those issues as well. Next slide, please. Tribal court activities. The tribal court is one of your key partners in all of this work to implement Title IV-E. There's reimbursement and eligibility issues that are very important in the judicial determinations that the tribal court will make. And so you want to have your partnership well established and be able to know exactly what it is and how it fits with the kind of court you have. We know that there are different types of tribal courts out there. All of them essentially doing the same kinds of thing, which is adjudicating child welfare proceedings. but not necessarily organized in the same fashion. And there's great latitude for tribes to organize their courts under federal law. So for tribes, trying to understand how to deal with things like VPA, which is voluntary placement agreements, if they need to be involved in that, or thinking about emergency removals, and also what kinds of forms and kinds of language need to be in the court orders. All of these are important things. At the last bullet, you'll see it says Nunc Pro Tunc, which just means now for then. And this is a specific fostering connections provision that allows tribal courts or tribes, once they've been approved for Title IV-E, to have up to 12 months to go back and basically redo tribal court orders that were done before 4E was being implemented within the tribe, to help make those children tribal 4E eligible. It was basically kind of a helping hand for tribes in making sure that those kids who would have been eligible for 4E could be eligible to receive those services. So it's a nice provision that's going to be real helpful. And we talked a little bit about what your thinking might be about whether you wanted to use an affidavit or you want to go back and do tribal court orders, depending on your caseload size and things like that. Next slide, please. Services coordination. One of the things that anyone who wants to do the 4E program has to deal with is the coordination piece, because not only are children eligible for other programs like Medicaid based on their eligibility for 4E, but there are other services that they're going to need. That doesn't mean that 4E is going to pay for those services necessarily, but it does mean that there needs to be some coordination. And if you're, for instance, if you're a tribe it's only been doing case management for kids and maybe placing children in homes using a limited amount of BIA funds, or maybe you didn't even have BIA funds, this will bring, as you implement 4E or think about implementing 4E, this will bring some new issues to the table about how you'll be needing to coordinate. Child support enforcement is another area where there's required coordination. Does your tribe have a child support enforcement program, or will you need to coordinate with state child support enforcement? And so there are a lot of intergovernmental issues there that need to be kind of worked through, and we've tried to identify those to help tribes think about that. Next slide, please. Data collection and reporting. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of conversation about 4E and AFCARS. AFCARS stands for Adoption Foster Care Automated Reporting System. It's the system that anyone who's operating, any program that's operating 4E has to report their data to. There are a little over 100 elements in the AFCARS data system, and the AFCARS system actually is something that has, if tribes look at the data that they're already collecting, many times what you'll find is it's very similar. There are some differences, though, as well. And one of the things that's kind of unique to AFCARS is that how you collect the data and how you submit the data can be slightly different. In other words, a tribe has to think about, are they going to invest in a more expensive, robust sort of electronic data collection system, because in reporting that data, they're probably going to have to report it. They are going to have to report it to the federal AFCARS system, which requires an electronic transmission. There are issues around whether the system a tribe would develop or even a state would be proprietary or not. There are a number of different things that need to be considered. And then there's SACWIS, which is State Automated Child Welfare Information System. That's another system which includes the AFCARS data, but also includes a lot of other data elements too. And there are some issues about whether a tribe, and some opportunities there to get enhanced reimbursement, but of course there's going to be additional work required if you build a bigger SACWIS system. So there's a lot of information there. We didn't go into a great amount of detail here, more trying to just identify sort of the key requirements and for tribes and help them think about how they might want to organize and measure their readiness in this area. And as we said here, you can see in the discussion, it isn't just developing the system, it's also maintaining and operating the system after you developed it that you have to also consider as well. Next slide, please. fiscal management, this is obviously an important issue. For tribes, under Fostering Connections Act, their tribes are allowed to use, and actually through other federal law, allowed to use some of their 638 funding, which is basically contracted funding from Bureau of Indian Affairs or Indian Health Services, to help meet some of the match requirements of 4E, the non-federal match requirements. They're also allowed to use in-kind funding sources for under the training and administrative components of Title 4E. So if you have some folks that you're working with who are maybe providing some services, some training, or some equipment or things like that under the training or administrative areas, you may be able to count some of that as in-kind. It's an important opportunity. States don't have that opportunity, but tribes do. And the Children's Bureau will be developing regulations to kind of further guide and also kind of define how this will look in the future. So, but this tends to be one of the areas where tribes have to have the most to consider. As most of us know, many tribes are operating on very lean budgets. Of course, states are as well. But tribes don't always have general revenue like states do, and so sometimes you have to think about where are we going to get those funds and how are we going to organize those. And when we get to the fiscal calculator, Terry's going to be able to give you some more information about how this will look, some more detailed information. Okay, next slide, please. The last area is training activities, the domain area. And this is another significant area. Under 4E, there's the maintenance portion, which is the payments that you make to the foster care providers who are actually, which help subsidize the care of that child. And then there are the administrative activities, the casework, and all that work that goes on to maintaining that child in that placement. And then the training activities for both the staff who are involved in 4E placement work, as well as the care providers themselves. So it's not a surprise that 4E requires that you have a training plan. How are you going to be able to train on an ongoing fashion the people that need this kind of training and help maintain the skill sets that you need? So there's some things under Fostering Connections now, some new provisions that allow some increased flexibility for both tribes and states to include others in 4E trainings that wasn't there before. Obviously, I mentioned there's the match issue. You can use maybe in-kind. Training is an area where in-kind might come into play more often than not. And thinking about also where is the training going to be, or who's going to help develop the training. Now, there's lots of opportunities there potentially, whether it's tribal colleges or tribal programs. It could even be state academy, training academies. There's already some partnerships between tribes and states in that area. So there's a number of different things, options that you have here, and we tried to identify what some of those were and what some of the thinking behind those might be. Next slide, please. And then some further areas. These aren't necessarily organized in any of the domain areas, but there was, there were some things about developing a 4E application that we knew weren't necessarily addressed specifically in the regulations. And some of that had to do with planning and sort of technical assistance. So we have three areas here. We talked about planning and application development. Earlier I talked about a suggested process. But there's also some other planning pieces that go into probably developing that. And some of this is the tribes that are doing this right now are sort of paving the way, I think, in exposing some new learning and some new experiences that we can all kind of glean from. And then technical assistance and 4E development grants. There's a new National Resource Center for tribes that's going to be fully operational, I believe, here coming the next fiscal year. Right now they're doing some assistance, needs assessment, national needs assessment with tribes and others. And the 4E development grants, which allow tribes, they're competitive, but allow tribes who get awards up to 2 years and $300,000 over 2 years to be able to use that funding to help them get ready to develop and submit an approvable plan for 4E. And we also wanted to make sure that in thinking about this, when you have technical assistance needs of any type, it's good to think about not just what is the issue, but what is the kind of technical assistance that you need, and what is the best way for it to be delivered in your community, for your program, your staff, your community. So these are the kinds of things that we also want to help people think about as well. And then program management. Once you get the program up and running, you're going to have some management issues, probably some new ones that you didn't have before. And thinking about how you might want to kind of tailor or structure some of those management issues, how you might want to approach some of those. So those are essentially all of the things that are in the matrix. And apologize, I wish we had more time. We could have gone into these in more depth. But the document, as I said, is being piloted right now, and we're very excited to have the experiences that we have shared with us, so we'll be able to improve the document even more, and then be able to disseminate it more broadly here later in the year. Next slide, please.
David, I think we're actually ready to pull up the tool.
Yeah.
And Perry can begin his portion.
Okay.
And can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. And I'm
Great.
going to go ahead and give you the mouse here.
Terrific.
Okay.
And I want to begin by saying a little bit about how we developed and why we developed this calculator. This is a program that it has a lot of complex parts, and so it is hard to determine what the fiscal impact is of taking it on without having some way to look at the interaction between the various parts. We thought that a tool that would use an Excel spreadsheet or a couple of Excel spreadsheets could be devised to tell a person planning this just what the picture might look like. And after working on it, it took 12 different spreadsheets to integrate it all and to be able to come up with an answer at the end. And so I'm going to work through these. As David said, they're still in the testing phase, and but we can show you how it works. It also, we realized that this is a technical assistance tool. We're working hand in hand with several tribes who we're testing it with, because there are enough nuances locally that, and from state to state, that it is difficult to devise something where one tool fits everyone. But I think we've done a fairly comprehensive job here. So the first sheet is just a set of instructions on how to work through each step. And we're going to work through them. I won't go through this, but we're going to work through each step. So as I move to the FMAP calculator, this is the federal reimbursement rate that is applied to the foster care payment. In our calculator, we've applied the same formula that's applied to states to come up that ACF sets the FMAP rate for states. Now, the federal legislation says that ACF will set the FMAP rate for tribes, but what we're trying to do is give tribes an idea of what their FMAP rate might be if the same calculation that's used for states is applied to the tribes. So number one on this calculator, you enter, and any green box is a box where data can be entered. Everything else is locked. So to enter a per capita income, usually that information is available in census or from planning department. The tribe, this is a fictitious Washington state tribe. If the tribe's per capita income were $15,000, we entered that in this green box, then we choose the state through a drop-down menu, so we can choose any state, but in this case we've gotten Washington. No, we just changed it to Utah here, and back to Washington. Okay, it tells us that Washington's FMAP rate currently is 57.72%. A tribe whose per capita income was $15,000. If you applied the same formula that's applied to the state, the FMAP rate for the tribe would be 92.49%. However, the ceiling that the highest it can be currently is 83%, so the tribe would hit the ceiling of the FMAP rate. Certainly in negotiating with ACF, a tribe could use this data to help make a solid argument for why their FMAP rate should be 83 or higher. Now, the legislation also says that in no case will the FMAP rate will be lower than the state rate, so that's the floor, so we put the floor in there. Now, the penetration rate calculator is dependent on three different pieces of data. Again, we plug in the state on the drop-down menu and see then the range. And again, this is a very simplified version. It's a bit more complicated than this. But if the gross monthly income of the family, based on a family of 3 from the 1996 AFDC eligibility information, if the income is over the large number, then they're not eligible. If it's below the small number, they definitely are, and if it's in between, they probably are. And that's about as close as we could get in a simplified version of this. Then you have to determine the percent of your population that you think would be in that eligibility category. So it's really asking the question, how many people live in poverty? This particular tribe chose 90%. Again, that's a drop-down menu. We have a third item, another dependency for what the penetration rate will be is the percent that will meet the judicial criteria. In other words, are the court orders written correctly? This tribe has a tribal court that's been doing this right along, so they estimated that their rate would be 100%. A new tribe, not having handled this before, might want to go to 90% or below. And you can see how the FMAP, or how the penetration rate gets affected. The last item that impacts the penetration rate is the number that will be in licensed homes. If there are placements in non-licensed homes, say in relative care where they're not licensed, that will impact the outcome. So just by dropping each of those items to 90%, the penetration rate drops to 73%. This number is extremely important because it carries through all of the calculator and can make the difference of thousands of dollars and tens of thousands of dollars at the end of the year. This is a very important number, and it, in a sense of planning, it will show the judicial staff and the fiscal staff, the licensing staff, just how important it is to bring these numbers up as high as possible. And we'll move on to the foster care rate finder. We have, now this is simply choosing the state, and this provides the foster care rates. These numbers are taken from the National Resource Center for Permanency Planning Foster Care, and we're updating those in each state as we're working with tribes to make sure we have current numbers, because they change on a fairly regular basis. So the next calculator is caseload and staffing. it takes it's simply entering numbers of what the various types of cases are, the current ICWA cases that are 4E eligible, the at-risk of placement cases, the number of infants and toddlers, school age, adolescents, any guardianships. So you come up with a total caseload, and the calculator then calculates how many how many staff it would take to serve that particular number of cases. And I'm going to there's a choice about whether to use preset formulas or to use a staffing pattern of your own liking. And so what is shown on the calculator is a formula, and these, whether you're using the preset formula or your own staffing pattern, runs through the entire calculator. The other item on this particular page, you enter your annual salary data for each of your positions, and again, this data will run through every aspect of the calculator. Let's move on to in order to figure out what the costs and reimbursements are at the end of the process, the calculator needs to know what your indirect cost rate is and what your fringe benefit rate is and how the indirect cost rate is calculated. So and as these things are adjusted, it ripples through the entire calculator. This particular tribe indirect cost rate is based on a percentage of all direct costs. That it's set at 31%, and fringe benefit rate is at 28%. So these things are all will impact later on. This sheet, there's no data to enter. This simply tells what the maintenance reimbursement would look like given the rates and the caseload. It gives a per child amount and the per child amount that would be needed from non-federal dollars to pay for that child, then calculates it on the basis of the full caseload, and then gives an estimate of if the tribe were to take this service over from the state, how much would the state be saving, and this may be of value in any kind of negotiation with regard to negotiating a tribal state agreement or negotiating a scenario where the state might pick up a portion of the match cost. The next page in the calculator is a projection of in-kind match. There, you see in the bottom right-hand corner that there's a figure which tells you what the in-kind cannot exceed. In the legislation, the amount of in-kind was limited, and there's a couple of different formulas that are applied to different kinds of activities. So we've calculated that, and this is actually an in-kind budgeting. How much do you think you can get in-kind from volunteers? Now, 4E isn't, the word match is used, but it's not a true match in that you have to come up with money in addition to what the federal government gives. It's that you spend the money and then only get reimbursed a portion of what you spent. And this is basically saying it doesn't have to be your money that you spend. If you spend somebody else's money, either in cash or the other party had to spend cash in order for the service to happen and contributes that in kind, then you can count that, which makes some of this much more feasible for tribe. This particular tribe tribal scenario saying that the tribe feels they can come up with $4,100 in kind on a month, and these are monthly figures on a monthly basis. So that's that's a fairly modest figure, though it is. You have to be pretty good at attracting in-kind contributions and tracking and monitoring them. So we'll move on to the training cost estimator. Training costs are calculated differently in 4E because they're reimbursed at 75%. And so there's a couple of examples provided in the calculator about how those figures might be calculated. We also separated out the in-kind from with regard to training, and that gets actually carried back to the earlier spreadsheet on calculating the in-kind. But here's a scenario where in this particular month, on a monthly basis, this budget is, there's $2,200 of training going forward, half of that being in-kind, half of it being cash cost, and this tells you what's reimbursable of that. So I've moved too far here. Then we can go on to the sheet that calculates the claimable claimable costs. And since many of the costs have been put in earlier in the spreadsheet, there are just a few things to enter in this sheet. I need to, there it is. You enter things like if you have a consultation budget, entering your occupancy, your rent costs, if that's not included in your indirect costs, your monthly mileage, travel costs associated with the foster care, your and any other direct costs per month. And with we've been working with tribes who were testing the calculator just in looking at actual fiscal expenditures for over several months' time. And that gets plugged in, and it calculates based on the caseload and on the salaries and fringe and indirect and all of this information. It comes up with a reimbursable amount. Then there's the next slide is probably the most challenging and the most complicated. It is the slide that applies each formula, because each 4E reimburses for different types of services in a different way, and it applies to each service the reimbursement rates, and it handles that in the form of a time study. And so in consultation with the potential applicant, we're looking at different strategies as to how to allocate the time, the projected time that workers will spend on various activities. This particular tribe has separated out child protection from the foster care program, and so they don't have any hits, any staff time going into child protection, and so they're not doing adoption, so their time is spread over the other 4E allowable costs. So the bottom line here is down below, it tells us that in this bottom right-hand corner, of $74,000, almost $75,000 in a month's time that's been spent, 4E will reimburse $28,000 of that. So you can tell right away that it is, you have to be operating a fairly robust foster care program with funding from some sources in order to be able to operate this. And so tribes that are currently have some funding sources for foster care, either internally or from the state or from their 638 or self-governance funding, will have a much easier time than those that are thinking of starting this without an existing source. And those existing sources are handled on the next sheet. What is the available cash match? And this particular tribal scenario, there's state contracts and awards that are available. Their ICWA grant is available. There are the state matching funds, and one of the things that all tribes need to think about is the issue of child support and the ability to collect some amount of child support from the parents of children in care. So this shows an existing amount of cash available as match of almost $30,000. Also, you'll note here that we've again flagged the amount that the state will save by having the tribe do the service directly. Again, a potential negotiating point for working with the state on sharing the cost of the match, potentially. Then finally, the last sheet gives the bottom line scenario. This is, in this scenario, the unmet match needed is per month about $16,000. And so annually, almost $200,000, $193,000 a year that's of an unmet need. Now, some of that might be captured. There's a potential another $10,000 of in-kind that might be captured, bringing that number quite low. Also, I want to just demonstrate one last thing here, and it's what the impact is on the penetration rate. Because if you see that's currently at $16,000 a month, if we were to get just a little bit better with the penetration rate, so if we could judicially, if 95% of the court orders were correct, and let's say 95% of the kids were in licensed facilities, and then we go back to the cost, the summary, we've reduced the annual amount needed by almost, well, it's about $35,000. So you can see that a few percentage points in the penetration rate will make a tremendous difference at the end of the day. So making sure that as you're planning for the program, that you know very clearly that your licensing program and your tribal court are doing their reviews, and the language of the court orders are in compliance with the law, will greatly help the rate of reimbursement. And I think I'll leave it at that. We've been making many additions and improvements as we work through this with each of the tribal pilot sites, and we think eventually we can make it available through for actual technical assistance through webinars like this on a per tribe-by-tribe basis. So thank you.
Thanks, Terry. I'm actually going to turn it back over to Madeline to close us out here. And Madeline, I'm going to give you the mouse.
All right, thank you.
You're all set to go.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Terry and David for an amazing presentation on two tools that, gosh, what a gift to have this kind of guidance and fiscal calculation and other guidance available. These are tools that certainly have not been available in the past, so it was very exciting to hear about them, and we're certainly looking forward to the results of your pilot testing and making the tools more widely available when you're ready to do that. So we are certainly inviting all of our participants to send questions. A number of you sent some excellent questions during the webinar. We will be fielding these questions with Terry and David, and we'll be responding to you. The questions were really great. If you have any questions about other topics related to the Fostering Connections implementation, please email your questions to the Resource Center. You can also directly reach out to the National Indian Child Welfare Association for responses to other questions. Those that you've sent in today will automatically be answered. But if you have other questions that you would like NICWA to help you with, you see on this slide contact information for both David and for Ashley Horn. The Resource Center can also broker or offer limited technical assistance to agencies. And once again, please feel free to forward your information, your request onto the Resource Center. So in closing, let me just add that there are more than 500 state and national resources available on the Fostering Connection Resource Center website. Here, once again, you see the website for the Resource Center. Among the many important resources that we feel you might be particularly interested in is the document Title 4E, Helping the Tribes Meet the Legal Requirements. It's an excellent, excellent guide. There is a copy of the Title 4E preprint for you to review, and then an excellent report on key considerations and best practices for tribal Title 4E data collection and reporting. Once again, this information is on the Resource Center website, as will all of these slides that you've seen today. They will also be posted on the Resource Center website. A couple of you emailed asking about where to get them. Go to www.fosteringconnections.org. There's also much more there in addition to the resources we have listed on this slide. So we want to thank you for participating in this webinar. Again, want to thank Terry and David for an amazing presentation. An audio recording will also be available on the Fostering Connections website. Our next webinar is actually this Thursday at 3:30. Supporting tribal child welfare through a better understanding of the opportunities under Fostering Connections. David Simmons will again be joining us, as well as Arlene Templer. You can sign up for that webinar at the Fostering Connections website. Also invite you to participate in the discussion forum. You can find information on joining LinkedIn and register for the Fostering Connections group, and there you have the website address to go to that. So feel free to contact us at the Resource Center, as well as to contact the National Indian Child Welfare Association David or Ashley. We want to just thank you for your participation today, invite you to come again, and as you can see on our final slide, what a beautiful slide from NCWA. Let us put our minds together and see what kind of life we can build for our children. A beautiful quote from Sitting Bull. So thank you so much for your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.